He looked me straight in the eye across that polished oak table on the 12th floor and said coldly, "If you're not satisfied with the salary, the door's right there." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I already held something he couldn't see. The key to bring down everything he thought he controlled without raising my voice. 25 years. That's how long I gave to Norwood Dynamics, a tech firm in Denver that I once believed was my second home. I stayed when others left, pulled all-nighters when deadlines loomed, and stood in front of every storm that threatened to sink the ship. I wasn't just a senior technical lead, I was the one holding this place together. But then, last April, after my first round of chemotherapy, they called me in not to check on my health, but to discuss a shift in team alignment. I had braced myself for many things, but not to be replaced by a 30-year-old kid with slick back hair, an Ivy League degree, and a habit of never making eye contact when he spoke. They called it generational transformation. I called it being discarded. What hit me hardest wasn't the job loss itself, it was how they did it. Quietly, politely, with surgical precision. My system access revoked overnight. My calendar wiped clean. No farewell from coworkers. No gratitude from leadership. Just closed doors and averted gazes, as if I'd never been there at all. But what they didn't realize, what they never cared enough to learn, was that I didn't walk out of there empty-handed. Because over those decades of dedication, I had built something they depended on daily. A proprietary analytics engine used by both the strategy and sales teams to stay afloat. And they had forgotten one crucial fact. I never signed it over. I thought I'd seen the worst of corporate cruelty, but nothing could prepare me for how thoroughly they would erase me. Not fire, erase me, like I'd been a placeholder, a footnote never worth acknowledging. The Monday after that meeting, I returned to the office not because I hadn't understood the message, but because I needed to witness with my own eyes how far they were willing to go to make me disappear. My keycard still worked, though just barely. My name was still on the door, but the desk inside had already been cleared. In my place sat a newer, shinier model, Ryan. Fresh MBA, shiny shoes, and just enough charm to make up for the fact that he didn't yet know what he didn't know. No one looked directly at me when I walked past. The few who dared offered half-hearted nods or averted their gaze entirely. One of Thema junior associate I'd mentored for 2 years mouthed, "I'm sorry," then turned quickly back to her screen. My email had been disabled, my project files reassigned, and my calendar wiped so clean you'd think I'd never booked a single meeting in 25 years. There was no HR meeting, no exit interview, no final word, just silence. As if the weight of my absence might go unnoticed if it wasn't acknowledged aloud. But silence has a way of revealing things. When people don't speak, they show. And what they showed me in those days that followed was that loyalty, sacrifice, and decades of sweat meant nothing when stacked against age, illness, and their addiction to youthful energy. I didn't leave immediately. Instead, I sat quietly in the small, unused conference room on the 5th floor, the one I used to escape to when deadlines threatened to crush me. This time, though, it wasn't for focus. It was for surveillance. I watched Ryan give presentations, using slides I had built, speaking with words I'd carefully crafted. I saw my legacy, piece by piece, co-opted and rebranded under his name. I listened as senior leadership praised his fresh perspective, while conveniently forgetting that the strategies he paraded around had been refined under my direction through countless late nights, broken holidays, and years of lived experience they could never download into him, no matter how much they tried. The betrayal didn't come with a single blow. It came slowly, methodically, like rust eating away the frame of something once solid. Clients who used to call me directly now routed their questions through his assistant. The performance metrics I'd been responsible for suddenly had no author. The analytics tool I had designed quietly, carefully, and with the kind of passion they never bothered to notice was now being touted as a team achievement, with no mention of the man who had conceived it. They didn't fire me, because firing requires ownership. It requires acknowledgement. Instead, they hoped I would wither, vanish, and quietly become someone else's anecdote about how times change. But I didn't vanish. I watched, I listened, and most of all, I remembered. Every phrase, every glance, every policy memo that hinted at what they were really doing, purging the old, the sick, and the inconvenient in favor of something more photogenic for investors. There was no room for a cancer survivor with a 2.3 GPA from a state college and a spine that had spent too long in boardroom chairs. Not when they had a new generation of buzzword chasers ready to climb over each other in polished shoes and curated resumes. Still, I kept my seat in that forgotten conference room for a week, and every day, someone stopped by. A former colleague, a vendor contact, even one of the board members' executive assistants. They asked the same questions, though in different words. What happened to you? Are you okay? Do you need help? I gave them no drama, just facts. I wanted them to see the truth for themselves, not through some HR filtered narrative, but raw and unedited. And then came the final act of erasure. An internal announcement went out announcing Ryan's appointment as strategic advisor to the innovation team. My title, my domain, not a mention of transition, no acknowledgement of my years in the role, just a new name, a new face, and a line that read, effective immediately. I sat still for a long time after reading that, not out of shock, but out of calculation. They believed I'd finally break. They mistook my silence for surrender. What they didn't realize was that while they were busy polishing their lies and shifting credit, I had been quietly preparing something much more powerful than retaliation. A return. I didn't argue, I didn't storm out, I didn't beg for reconsideration or make some grand, tear-stained speech about loyalty or fairness. I just stood quietly, picked up my coat, and walked out of the office with defeat in my bones, but with something much sharper, clarity. They mistook my silence for weakness. They assumed that because I wasn't making noise, I had accepted their version of the story. But I've learned that the loudest man in the room is often the one with the least to say. So I kept quiet not because I had nothing, but because I had everything, and they weren't ready to see it. Over the weekend, the messages trickled in like slow drips from a leaking faucet short, vague, anxious. Are you okay? What happened in that meeting? Please tell me you're not leaving. And then came the one that changed everything. It was from a colleague I'd once trusted, someone who knew how the gears turned at Norwood. He wrote, just so you know, Marcus told the exec team that you're taking some time off to rest. He's already reassigned your accounts to Olivia. Olivia, the intern turned assistant who'd been promoted faster than anyone could blink, not because she understood the work, but because she understood Marcus's habits, his moods, and how to laugh at his jokes without missing a beat. She was young, eager, and pliable, everything I was no longer. The fact that she'd taken my desk while I was still technically on payroll was not just insult tinged, it was calculated. That Monday, I returned to the office. Not to reclaim a role I knew they'd already stripped from me, but to observe, because when you've built something with your own hands, you want to watch how they try to dismantle it. My badge still buzzed me in, though my name was no longer on the internal org chart. I found an empty spot in the far corner of the building-in unused breakout room with flickering fluorescent lights, and a view of the parking lot made it my temporary office. I didn't make a scene. I didn't speak unless spoken to, but I watched, I listened, and I noticed everything. How Olivia tried to explain strategies she didn't fully understand. How Marcus dodged questions he couldn't answer. How clients started to grow restless, confused, unsure why the person they trusted was suddenly silent. I sat in that forgotten corner with my personal laptop and kept working not for them, but for me. And slowly, quietly, the tide began to shift. People started coming to Minot all at once, and never publicly, but they came, one by one. Some just needed to talk. Others asked questions, cautiously, like they were afraid to be seen. I didn't feed them gossip or play the victim. I simply told them the truth. I told them what happened. I told them why. And in doing so, I did something Marcus never could have made people think. It was in that silence away from the buzz of the office politics, the fake smiles, the performative loyalty that I remembered who I was. I wasn't just the man they had overlooked. I was the man they had depended on for 2 decades. I was the system. I was the strategy. I was the voice they trusted in boardrooms and behind closed doors. And they'd forgotten that not all power needs a title. By Friday, Marcus finally summoned me to his office. He sat there with his signature smirk and a glass of that overpriced mineral water he always sipped during uncomfortable conversations. He leaned back in his chair and gave me his well-rehearsed corporate charm. "Henry, you've had a good run here, but things are evolving, and maybe it's time to move forward." I looked at him not with anger, not even with resentment, but with a stillness that made him blink. "You're right," I said. "I have had a good run, and you're right about one more thing. I don't move on. I move forward." I placed the envelope containing my resignation on his desk, stood up, and left the building for what they thought would be the last time. But I wasn't leaving with nothing. I was leaving with my name, my mind, and something far more valuable than revenge. I was walking away with a blueprint. And they had no idea what was coming. I didn't disappear. I simply went quiet something. Most people mistake for surrender, but those who truly know resilience understand it's just the beginning of a deeper move. In that silence, I wasn't licking my wounds or mourning a lost position. I was building, shaping the next step with the kind of precision they never thought I was capable of because they had already decided my story was over. I spent the next week not grieving, but mapping. I opened the old files I had encrypted years ago, the ones they assumed were company property but had never asked me to sign over. Pulse Logic, a tool I'd begun building long before Norwood Dynamics even knew it needed something, like it was still mine in every way that mattered. I had written every line of code on my own time, refined its logic during weekends they never paid me for, and improved it through feedback they never gave. And because no one in legal had ever cared enough to do their job thoroughly, the tool was registered under my name, not theirs. They had used it, paraded it in board meetings, sold it as a competitive edge in investor pitches, and now, without me, they were still using it, believing I'd walk away quietly and let them keep what I bled to create. That was their first mistake. The second was assuming I was alone. Over the years, I had built more than software. I had built trust. Clients who'd requested me by name for every major pitch, colleagues who stayed late because I stayed with them, vendors who returned my calls even on holidays. These people remembered even if the company had chosen to forget. By Tuesday, I had contacted 3 longtime partners, people I'd helped guide through some of the hardest marketing slumps of the last decade. And when they learned I was no longer at Norwood, they didn't offer condolences. They asked, almost in unison, "Are you available?" When I told them yes, and that Pulse Logic was still mine to use, the conversation shifted fast, from sympathy to interest, from curiosity to opportunity. I wasn't going to announce my return with a billboard. That's not how people like me move. I set up a limited liability company under a name that carried no ego, only purpose, Grainpoint Solutions. A name that sounded small, but firm, rooted, and deliberate. I designed the branding myself, clean, minimal, sharp. Then I built a landing page late one night from my kitchen table, the glow of the screen painting my face in soft blue light as I typed the final tagline: strategy, substance, silence, broken. By Thursday, the site was live. The email was up, the pitch decks were ready. But what made it different, what made it dangerous, was what powered it beneath the surface. Every client proposal, every market forecast, every timing matrix I built was rooted in data harvested from Pulse Logic. My Pulse Logic, and because Norwood hadn't paid to license it after my exit, every query they ran, every insight they pulled, was a legal liability waiting to explode. I gave them 1 week, not out of generosity, but out of strategy. 1 week to realize what they were still running depended on something they no longer had rights to. 1 week to approach me, to make it right, to do the honorable thing before the legal wheels began turning. But they didn't. Instead, they acted like I never existed. Word from inside told me that Marcus had told the board I'd left in frustration and taken nothing with me. He told them I was burnt out, that I was resting, maybe enjoying retirement. He even joked during one leadership meeting that I'd probably be fishing in Oregon before I ever showed my face again. That was his third mistake, because while he was laughing, I was writing. While he was dismissing me, I was drafting the cease and desist letter, clear, formal, and airtight. I outlined the full registration of Pulse Logic under my name, attached proof of authorship, IP filings, code signatures, and outlined the exact violations they were committing with every passing day. I didn't threaten them. I gave them 72 hours to shut it down. And then I waited, not with anger, but with calm. There was no apology, no phone call, no legal negotiation, just a cold email reply that read like a corporate ghost note. After internal review, we see no issue. This matter is considered closed. That was it. They thought that would be the end of it, that I'd read those words and fold, that I'd vanish quietly, just as they had hoped. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I wasn't some forgotten relic of a bygone era. I was the architect of the system still running beneath their feet. And now I had the means to show the world exactly how much they had taken and how little they understood what it meant to build something real. I waited the full 72 hours. Not because I thought they would come to their senses deep down. I already knew they wouldn't, but because I wanted to give them every possible chance to act like the professionals they claimed to be. I gave them time to read the paperwork, to digest the evidence, to recognize that they had crossed a line far more dangerous than they understood. But when the silence stretched past that third day and all I received was a cold, legal brush-off disguised as resolution, I knew exactly what I had to do. They didn't want to acknowledge me, so I would make them impossible to ignore. That Saturday, with the morning sun rising soft through the blinds of my study, I opened my laptop and began recording. No dramatic lighting, no soundtrack, just me, speaking plainly, walking through every function of PostLogic, showing the code, the usage logs, and most importantly, the paper trail that proved I had built it with my own hands long before Norwood Dynamics ever pitched it to clients. I showed the version history, the IP registration, the emails that never got responses but carried every warning they had chosen to overlook. I recorded calmly, not with fury, but with precision. And when I was done, I encrypted the video with a watermark and shared it with two people I trusted more than anyone in that industry. The first was a journalist named Lydia Trent, someone who had interviewed me years earlier for a feature on ethical data use in business. She had a sharp mind, a deeper moral compass, and a reputation for not flinching when the pressure came. The second was a former investor in Norwood, a man who had pulled out shortly after Marcus was promoted, and who had once told me privately, "You're the only reason I ever trusted their numbers." I didn't expect immediate replies, but Lydia responded within hours. "Henry," she wrote, "this is devastating. I want to run it. Can you go on record?" "Not yet," I replied, "but soon." By Monday morning, word began to leak. Someone inside the company, maybe a tired intern, maybe a quiet ally, confirmed that an emergency board meeting had been scheduled, and just like that, the atmosphere began to shift. Marcus, who had strutted through the halls just a week earlier with that smug confidence he wore like cologne, was now avoiding eye contact. His name still carried weight, but the air around him had grown thin. I filed the official legal complaint at exactly 2 a.m., not a minute early, not a minute late. The letter restated everything: ownership, usage without license, refusal to engage in good faith resolution. It gave them 5 business days before formal litigation would commence. I expected chaos, but what I received was something colder. They responded with detachment, as though I were nothing more than a clerical inconvenience. After internal review, we find no grounds for your claim. We wish you well in your future endeavors. The words stung not because they dismissed me, but because they confirmed that, even now, they still believed I wouldn't fight. But what they didn't know was that I had never stopped. I compiled everything's source code comparisons, patent registrations, the full development timeline, and perhaps most damning of all, the internal emails I'd been quietly forwarded from a friend still deep inside Norwood's architecture team. Emails where Marcus instructed junior engineers to rebuild Henry's tool close enough that we can say we did it ourselves. Attachments showing slideshows where my name had been stripped from decks I had authored. One even contained a voice clip from a virtual meeting where he joked, "He's gone. What's he gonna do? Sue us?" I bundled it all and sent it back to Lydia. Her article dropped on Wednesday. Whistleblower exposes IP theft at Norwood Dynamics, and she brought proof. The headline spread like fire across LinkedIn, Reddit, and a dozen industry newsletters. Tech bloggers dissected the screenshots line by line. Developers chimed in with their own suspicions about Norwood's recent releases. Legal experts began weighing in publicly, citing clear grounds for infringement. My name started trending not because I was loud, but because the truth finally had a platform. At first, Marcus doubled down. He posted a statement on his personal profile, full of corporate platitudes and empty resilience. In times of progress, there will always be those who seek to drag us backward. It gained traction with the usual loyalist people who valued hierarchy over substance, but it didn't last. Because while his followers were busy defending a man they barely knew, others were coming forward with their own stories. A former marketing director posted about how she had been pushed out for not aligning with the new vision. Another from product development shared how Marcus had taken her work and presented it to the board as his own. Bit by bit, the curtain pulled back, and what stood behind it wasn't innovation. It was a man clinging to stolen light, hoping no one would notice the power had always belonged to others. And then came the collapse. 3 of Norwood's largest clients terminated contracts within 48 hours of the article. An anonymous source leaked Slack conversations between leadership mocking my illness, describing me as obsolete and emotionally unstable. One investor called for Marcus's suspension pending investigation, but the final blow came from within Olivia. The assistant he had groomed and promoted so quickly filed a formal complaint citing coercion, cover-ups, and pressure to sign backdated non-disclosure agreements. The board had no choice. On Friday afternoon, they issued a statement. Effective immediately, Marcus Givens has been terminated from Norwood Dynamics following multiple breaches of ethical and operational conduct. We are entering a licensing agreement with the original creator of Pulse Logic, Henry Reeves. They didn't apologize, they didn't name me as a hero, but they finally put my name where it belonged, in ink. That evening, I didn't celebrate. I didn't post. I didn't even respond to the flurry of messages pouring into my inbox. I just sat by the window, a cup of tea in hand, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one. I wasn't seeking revenge for the sake of destruction. I had simply chosen not to vanish. And now, in the quiet, I was rebuilding not to reclaim the past, but to carve something truer from the wreckage they left behind. I didn't return to Norwood Dynamics, not to visit, not to gloat, not even when the board sent a carefully worded email offering a settlement and a quiet meeting to discuss collaboration opportunities moving forward. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop without replying. There was nothing left for me in that building, not because I had nothing to prove, but because I had already proven it, not just to them, but to myself. Instead, I poured all that energy, that clarity born from pain, into something better. I partnered with Elise, a brilliant systems architect I had worked with in the early days, someone who had once been overlooked for promotion because she took time off to care for her father with dementia. Together, we built a firm that didn't ask for a resume before asking about values. We called it Signal Route because everything we touched had to send the right signal, from integrity to innovation, from people first to profit second. In just under 6 months, we had signed 4 former clients from Norwood clients who didn't just want performance, they wanted purpose. They came not because we were cheaper, but because we stood for something. We built lean, moved fast, and didn't waste hours on meetings designed to inflate someone else's ego. My days became full again, not with politics or posturing, but with real work, meaningful challenges, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every decision, every partnership came from a place I could stand behind without apology. And then, one morning in early spring, a letter arrived, no return address, just a plain envelope with my name handwritten on the front. Inside was a single folded note and a printed article clipped from a trade journal. The note read, "You probably don't remember me. I was an intern at Norwood when it all happened. You spoke to me once in the hallway when everyone else just walked past. I watched what they did to you. I watched what you did in return, and it made me believe in something again. Thank you." I stared at the paper for a long time, not because the words were extraordinary, but because they were real. That was the moment I realized the true win wasn't the headlines or the settlements or even Marcus's downfall. It was the ripple, the unseen shift in people who had once felt powerless, but now knew better. I've been asked many times whether I felt vindicated, whether I had finally gotten justice. And while I understand the craving for that word, it doesn't quite fit. What I got wasn't revenge, it was restoration. Of my name, of my worth, of my story, because in the end, it was never just about Pulse Logic or a proprietary code. It was about reminding the world that people don't lose their value just because they get sick or old or inconvenient. That being written off doesn't mean you've been erased. That quiet dignity, steady resilience, and well-earned wisdom don't scream for attention, but they always find their way back into the light. Sometimes The loudest message you can send doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from walking away, building something better, and letting the truth do the talking. And so, if you're listening to this and you've ever been pushed aside, made to feel invisible, or told you were finished, I want you to remember something. You are not finished. Not even close. They might have underestimated you. They might have replaced you. They might have celebrated when you left. But what they never saw coming was your return. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've ever been that person who walked out with nothing but your dignity and a quiet plan, share this video. Let someone else know they're not alone. And if you've got a story of your own, we're listening. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more true stories of strength, justice, and the quiet power of not giving up.